Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted that you are all able to join us today for this discussion about understanding language access, the importance of recognizing this as a need in your organization, and exploring some pro tips and suggestions from our communications professionals today about implementing language access and helpful resources to do that. Just a few quick notes before we get started. While this will be a discussion between our speakers today, we highly encourage our live participants to submit any questions that you have at any point in time during this conversation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We definitely want to make sure that we're providing you all the helpful information that you need if there's something that we may be missing in our discussion. Also, this event will be recorded and saved on the YouTube channel for Luna Language Services. All participants who registered for the event will receive a follow-up email with that link so that you can watch later or share with any colleagues who may find the information helpful. With that being said, let's get started. My name is Tiffany Hansen. My pronouns are she and hers, and I am the Outreach and Engagement Manager for Luna Language Services. Luna is a language services provider, which means we engage in work like written document translation or live interpretation work, just like our fabulous American Sign Language interpreter that you see here with us today. Thank you, Mandy. My role is to work in the community to help organizations to communicate, provide services, and open up opportunities to members of our community whose native language is something other than English. We commonly refer to this as language access because we're providing accessibility to resources through language. I am absolutely delighted to get to work with some really incredible professionals in our community, many of whom are doing exceptional work in the nonprofit sector. And I'm really excited to introduce you to all three of my community colleagues today. So what I'd love to do is to have our panelists go ahead and introduce yourselves with your name, title, organization, and just a little bit about your background and experience with this subject. Duchess, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Awesome, thanks, Tiffany. As Tiffany mentioned, my name is Duchess Adjei. My pronouns are she and hers as well. And I'm the Regional Communication and Marketing Director for the American Red Cross. Specifically, the region that I serve is the Indiana region, which is actually a 4-state territory. Indiana, Ohio, parts of Kentucky, and Illinois. So we have a pretty big region. I joined the Red Cross in spring of 2016, which is wild to think what an incredible ride it's been. And at the Red Cross, I lead all of the internal and external marketing and communication, our media relations, PR, digital efforts. And I have about 10 years of experience in this field. And I think that my colleagues on this panel would definitely agree that as communication practitioners, it's difficult to do the work that we do and do it well when we're not multiculturalists. And basically multiculturalism is, someone who understands, values, and appreciates and supports the differences among a variety of cultural and ethnic groups. And so I'm super excited to be here with all of you and my panel as well.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Hindi. My pronouns are also she and hers. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at Exodus Refugee Migration. I'm really excited to be here today to be a part of this important discussion. As a Community Engagement Coordinator, I primarily work with our volunteers and work in different ways in the community to engage people in the mission of Exodus, whether that's through financial or in-kind donations, volunteerism, or advocacy. And for those of you who don't know, Exodus Refugee is a refugee resettlement agency that is located in Indianapolis, and we welcome refugees from all over the world and provide them with a wide variety of services like employment, helping families enroll their kids in school, scheduling medical appointments and taking clients to those medical appointments. We offer English classes and trainings and just a wide variety of services to ensure that refugees and other forcibly displaced populations are not only welcomed in Indianapolis, but are self-sufficient and are able to thrive in our city.
Thank you. Miss Jackie, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted.
I always forget about that. Thank you,
I do it
Tiffany.
all the time.
Yeah, so my name is Jackie Rodriguez, and I am the Marketing and Communications Manager at the Immigrant Welcome Center. The Immigrant Welcome Center is a nonprofit based in Indianapolis that serves immigrants and refugees as well. And we really focus on trying to connect immigrants to the resources that they need in order to build successful lives for themselves. So we also offer some virtual programs and services like access to citizenship classes and programs that kind of assist people in their citizenship application process as well. But I have been working in the nonprofit sector here in Indy for about 3 years. I originally started working for an organization called Indiana Health Centers, and eventually I was able to find this job with the Immigrant Welcome Center. Both of my parents are immigrants from Mexico, and I was born and raised in Indiana in South Bend. And so my role at the Immigrant Welcome Center, similar to Duchess's, is managing the internal and external communications for our employees, as well as for how we're presenting ourselves to the community and getting the word out about our services and things like that. So.
Thank you. And let me just say thank you all for the important work that you do every day. If we don't tell people about the work that we're doing, get the word out there, then we don't get to do the important work that we do. So thank you. So as we kind of get into this conversation, the first thing that I would like to do is establish why we all see this topic as important. And through that overview, kind of the cultural and the language-based demographics of our region. What I'd love to do is let's kind of talk through some information about what geographic area you serve. And some details about the cultural groups that your organization has worked with over the past several years. Jackie, let's go ahead and start with you first.
Sure. So Immigrant Welcome Center, we generally serve most residents or immigrants who reside in Marion County, but we also we have clients that are coming in from the donut counties as well. And we in the past have worked with organizations like the Haitian Association, the Indiana Latino Institute, and other multicultural organizations like La Plaza as well. But generally, I'd say that the majority of our clients are coming in from Marion County. A lot of them we see are coming from like the west side of Indianapolis. So there's different pockets, but yeah.
Okay. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so at Exodus, we primarily house newly arrived refugees in Indianapolis so that they are close to our office and all of our service providers that have worked with refugees in the past. But we've also, when working with other populations, asylees or asylum seekers, they also not necessarily live in Indianapolis, maybe around just the general central Indiana area. So that's basically the demographics in the city that we focus on.
And Sarah, especially, can you speak to some of the countries of which you're kind of seeing people come in? It's like, what are some of those international backgrounds, and maybe even list a few of the languages that you see are common languages in the folks that you serve?
Yeah, of course. So Exodus has been around in Indianapolis since 1981. So since then, we have served people from 50 different countries. So that's refugees, asylees, asylum seekers, special immigrant visas. And in fiscal year 2019, we welcomed 394 newly arrived refugees to Indianapolis. And folks come typically from a wide variety of countries, but the countries that we've primarily served and welcomed into Indianapolis, one being the largest a population from Burma, which is now also known as Myanmar. So Indianapolis actually has the largest Burmese population in the United States, which is really awesome. We started welcoming refugees from Burma around early 90s, and then that population has just grown so much in Indianapolis, and they're thriving in our city, and it's just been so amazing to see them grow in the city. The second, and in terms of Burma, so there's a lot of ethnic groups within that country, and people speak so many different languages, and just because someone is from Burma doesn't mean that they might necessarily understand each other. So in terms of ethnic groups, we primarily serve folks ethnicities from the Chin ethnicity as well as the Karen ethnicity. So folks from the Karen ethnicity live on the north side area of Indianapolis, Sonora area, And then the Qing community lives on the south side of Indianapolis. And the second largest population that we've served are folks from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, typically, again, depending on where they're from and in which country they fled to, they might also speak different languages, but a lot of them will speak French, Swahili, Kinyarwanda, which is a language that most people have never heard of, and they're always like, what? And so those are the languages that they speak. And then we've also served people from Syria who speak Arabic or Kurdish, people from Eritrea or Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Iraq. So just a wide variety of countries that speak so many different languages.
And I really love diving into that because I think a lot of folks who live in central Indiana, if you're not engaged directly with these populations, this may be an invisible demographic to you. And so really understanding just how diverse the international and linguistic background of our region is always really, I love bringing that up because I think it surprises some people sometimes.
Yeah.
To give just some really basic statistics that I use a lot to exemplify that, some things that were taken predominantly from the census is 1 in 20 Hoosiers at this point, so 1 in 20 residents here in Indiana are foreign born. So that's a pretty big percentage of our population. Here in Marion County, which is here in the Indianapolis area, 13.5% of residents prefer to speak a language other than English in their homes. And this is important for people to understand that while folks may be able to speak some English, to be able to communicate basic things when they're out in public, that doesn't mean that it's a language in which they prefer to disclose sensitive information or the best language for them to learn new information, right? And then the last one that I wanted to bring up was also thinking about the deaf and hard of hearing population. They are very present here in Indianapolis as well as nationally. There is a large population here in Indiana due to the Indiana School for the Deaf, which is a nationally renowned school on the northeast side of Indianapolis. And also just thinking much more broadly, American Sign Language is the 4th most common language used across the country. So just some things to think about. Now I know some of our attendees today are not from our region. If you'd like to find out more information about the language demographics in your own region, I suggest doing some research through recent census information, which hopefully will have some great updated information next year. This also includes the American Communities Survey, which is also referred to as the ACS. That resource definitely has some excellent information. And then there's a website, LEP, which stands for Limited English Proficiency. So it's lep.gov. And that has some really great demographic information about different regions in the country, as well as some resources of recent articles about those demographics in different areas. Now, obviously, Sarah and Jackie both work in organizations that very, very specifically and intentionally serve the immigrant and refugee population. Duchess, can you please speak a little bit about your recent multilingual campaign and why the American Red Cross made language access a priority?
Absolutely. We had a multilingual social media campaign, and it launched back in April, so a few months ago. And it was called the Doing My Part campaign, basically because we all have a part to do in the fight against COVID. And it was really important for us to speak to that. And I think it's important to make sure that people have the communication resources to be healthy and to be safe. And so when we heard, the CDC coming out with lots of information, the World Health Organization, as well as many others, pushing out these communication resources, I think our teams quickly realized that there were large swaths of populations that really weren't being communicated to. And so I think for us, it was a huge disconnect. And especially because we have many communities, as we've all been talking about just in the last 15 minutes, of people, we're global citizens. We have a lot of reason to connect with everyone. And so the idea that this world pandemic was raging and continues to still rage, affecting families and individuals is major. So the Doing My Part campaign was launched, and we actually had translation in several languages. I'm going to have my cheat sheet here just to make sure I get all of them. So we had Arabic, Burmese, Chinese, French, Hakachin, Spanish, American Sign Language, and of course English. And so these messages were disseminated to diverse audiences through key partnerships like the Immigrant Welcome Center. And the language support actually came from Luna, which was a huge help for us. And I really think that partners like Luna, like the Immigration Welcome Center, really helped us think about localization and the importance of localization, which is key because when you're creating communication materials, it's really important to think about some of those things that target specific demographics. And I think that's really key for us.
Thank you. Now, before our next section is to kind of think about the how of this discussion, but we actually had a few questions come in that I'm going to go ahead and throw to you guys. So the first, what attributes contributed to Indy having the largest Burmese population outside of Burma? Sarah, I'm wondering if this may be one for you specifically.
Yeah, so when refugees go through the process overseas to come to the United States, they will be asked if they know someone in the United States or from other countries who are offering resettlement. And because Indianapolis has grown to be such a large Burmese population, that folks always typically know someone in Indianapolis. And so then they put their name and contact information, and they're what we call, then they become their U.S. tie, so their family tie in the United States, because the program, the refugee resettlement program, focuses on self-sufficiency. And we know that folks who have experienced so much trauma, in order for them to thrive, sometimes it's best that they're around people who speak the same language as them, who are from the same country as they are. And so they're able to provide support for one another. And so that's why it has grown so much, because of that family tie.
And Sarah, I actually think the second question is for you as well. Can you please just go through just a couple of the languages spoken by immigrants from Burma as well as from the Congo?
Yeah, so in terms of people from the, people from Burma, they might speak Burmese, Falam, Chinhaka, Tidum, just a wide variety of languages, but I would say those are, and Karen, and those are, I would say, the top 5. And then folks from the Congo might speak French, but not a lot of them, Swahili, and Kinyarwanda.
Thank you. So now moving forward, thinking about, now that we've kind of talked about why this may be important, thinking about the demographics of the people that are in our region and making sure that we're reaching everyone. Let's think about the how. Where do people even start with thinking about language access and how to implement that? One thing, and we just kind of went through this a little bit, is I personally, the first thing I do is suggest starting with identifying which languages are important to your region and your consumer base. So Luna, as a language service provider, we provide services to a lot of the public service institutions like hospitals, court systems, schools, etc. The top languages in which Luna tends to provide services here in Central Indiana are Spanish, American Sign Language, Burmese, and dialects of Burmese. So there's actually, I think, 13 different dialects that we find just here in Central Indiana. Sarah just mentioned several of those. Arabic and Punjabi. Across the state of Indiana, you can also find a prevalence of French speakers and Chinese speakers, which is why I think Duchess included those in the American Red Cross campaign as well. Duchess, can you explain the process of how your team chose the languages that were prioritized for your campaign and how you implemented the language access tools that you put in place?
For sure. So the language selection process was really based on the demographics across our state. And so my team at the Red Cross, we created actually a website toolkit, which was really unique because it housed every single element that one would be interested in terms of trying to engage with the campaign. So we had social media posts, we had public service announcements, news releases, graphics, so that people could really engage with the campaign on social media. But then also there's this big question of continued access. And so for those without internet access, which is a thing, we worked with partners to help us develop plans to make sure that we could do safe drop-offs at people's homes, and also direct mail pieces, which was, I think, a really big help for those individuals and families who maybe wanted to be communicated to, but may not have had the information online. So for us, the website toolkit gave us access for every single tool for a participant that wanted to engage. And I think having these community partners really help us was, I think, really beneficial. In terms of amplification, that was the fun part, publicizing this whole campaign. We used our channels to get the word out to our media partners, social media partners as well, internal stakeholders. To help us really tell this story. And we also had digital billboards, which was great. And right now we're actually in the process of creating yard signs, and we will be distributing that with the help of our community partners. I'm not sure if everyone on this call knows, but we will be reaching out to you. And so it's just another great way to kind of push some of this important message out there.
And those are great examples. I love being able to have tangible things, tangible actions that people have done to be helpful and making sure the information is disseminated and that it reaches all these populations. Sarah and Jackie, can you also please provide some examples of where your organization typically comes across language barriers when you interact with your consumers? And Jackie, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I would say that we encounter these barriers pretty much at every step of the way because we are serving immigrants. And so for those that don't speak English or it's not their primary language, it happens from the moment that well, now they're not coming into the office, but prior to COVID-19, it comes in the form of, the moment that they contact us. And I'll touch on this later, but this year it was really exciting for us to launch our hotline for immigrants to call us in regards to the pandemic, but we did this in partnership with Luna Language Services. So we now have a multilingual hotline that's available in 200 different languages. And so we realized that, this was something that needed to be a priority and was sort of pushed, I guess, along the way because of the pandemic. We've been around in Indianapolis for, I think, 14 years. I'm not exactly sure, I'd have to check, but and this is the first time we've ever had something like this. So, it's taken us a while to get to this point, but I think that the pandemic really highlighted the disparities that exist in terms of language access. So this was a big move for us. But yeah, again, we encounter these sort of barriers in language at every step of the way when we're helping clients. So.
Okay, and Sarah, would you like to provide some examples of what you see over at Exodus as well?
Yeah, and I'll definitely echo Jackie and say definitely every step of the way. We've seen it happen with just a lot of services that we help refugees, but typically a few examples. So one would be the BMV. So folks getting access to driver's permits and driver's license is just such a hard process. And last year, a few years ago, the permit exam was translated in 5 different languages, but the BMV study manual was actually only in English. So that was a barrier where you could take the exam in a language that you are able to read, but you couldn't study for it because the book was only in English. So now, finally, the languages that the exam is in, now the book has those languages as well, so folks can study for their permit exam. But I would definitely say 5 languages is great, but there's also so much more languages that we still need for that. So encouraging folks to think about, yes, the main language is spoken in Indianapolis, but also continuing to be updated with the growing populations in the city. And another barrier would be employment from start to finish, right? So filling out a resume, filling out a job application, interviews, orientation. That's just such a hard and long process that when you don't speak English, or even if you do speak a little bit of English, it's still just a hard process to navigate, and you still need help with translations or an interpreter as well. So those are the 2 main examples that I would give.
That's great. And I like that you brought up the fact that, you know, with the BMV example, they're, you know, they chose to do it in 5 languages, but there's so many other languages represented here in the area. I know Luna serves appointments for over 100 different languages just in central Indiana. And so that's why, Jackie, I really loved that the Immigrant Welcome Center put in the capabilities for folks to call in that speak over 200 languages. So while your main efforts with translation or your main communications may be in the top languages in the region, which is really important, just having that additional support of over 200 languages for people to call in and ask questions, I think is really important. So thinking about resources, Sarah and Jackie, I'd love to ask what helpful and affordable, because we all know that's really important, especially in nonprofit work, resources have you used to overcome language barriers? And can you provide any examples of when a resource might be most appropriate? So Jackie, can we start with you on that one?
Sure. So historically, we have actually used our natural helper volunteers to serve as interpreters and translators for us. And this has been something that has worked well, but it's also a very time-consuming process. So essentially, an example of what this looks like is we'd have a client who would contact us in need of resources, or they need to be connected to another community organization. And if they mention that they don't speak English, or if they have someone on the phone with them who's indicating that I need a translator or an interpreter, then we would be responsible for circling back with our group of natural helper volunteers. And we would try to find someone who's available and who speaks that language, and then connect them with that client. And it's this whole time-consuming and relatively inefficient process, but it's been something that we use because it's accessible and affordable to us in terms of volunteer work. But this year, as I mentioned earlier, we ended up launching our language hotline. And so I think that has been a very affordable way for us to be more accessible and inclusive to immigrants that speak different languages. And then also our partnership with Luna has been really great because we have been able to get documents translated quickly, and I believe it's on a per piece sort of payment. So instead of having this large subscription that you're paying for, monthly subscription or something, it's more based on the pieces that you're getting translated individually. So that's been extremely helpful for us. And then we continue to use our natural helpers as we need. And then recently this year as well, we were able to get funding to hire 7 of our volunteers as natural helper specialists. So they are strictly dedicated to conducting wellness calls. They speak, I can't remember the exact languages they speak, but I think they represent seven countries. And so this is just an example of some of the ways we've been able to provide language access.
Excellent. Sarah, would you like to provide some of the resources that you all use as well?
Yeah, so one, and Jackie talked about this as well, so hiring staff who speak the languages that we primarily serve is really big for us, especially helping with that initial building trust and relationships with clients. Another example is that we also have contract interpreters at Exodus, and so we use them for Exodus purposes, so folks can't call Exodus to request an interpreter, but they're more for appointments that we have for clients so that we have just a faster access to them. And of course, when we don't have the language, we then will schedule, or when interpreters aren't available, we will use professional interpreting services like Luna to schedule in-house appointments as well. And then we constantly look at the community to see what services can we refer clients to that are interpreter friendly. So for example, PNC banks will provide interpreters for clients. And that's maybe not everyone knew that because there's not always signage in the banks, but that's a resource that we know. So we look at other services like that. For example, Windrow's clinic on the south side has hired interpreters on staff to work alongside the doctors and nurses in that clinic so that they have access to people in that staff and in the clinic who speak the languages of clients. So those are just some examples that we use to help navigate the language barriers.
And I want to point out, I think one important thing to talk about, especially as the language service provider, One resource that I do recommend to people that's kind of a bad word in our industry is Google Translate. Google Translate is an excellent resource if you have someone in front of you and you just need to figure out some basic information, or if someone sends you a message and you're just trying to get the gist of what they're trying to say, right? Like just basic understanding. I like to describe Google Translate, or what we call machine translation. Think of it as the equivalent of a third grader telling you what someone is saying, right? So the language that they're going to give you is going to be really basic. The grammar may not be there. The context, the words may be just a little bit wacky, but you can garner a basic understanding of what's happening with that. So when it's important to get professional translation services, or have a human actually translate it, is when it's really important for that language to be accurate. So in Duchess's example, having a billboard, could you imagine a billboard where the language was written by a third grader? Or having intake forms or important documents that you're having clients or consumers sign, or even notices of your services and privacy notices for folks, things like that, where it's really important for them to understand exactly what's going on. That's when it's really important to make sure that you're using a human translator, whether that's an internal team member or a volunteer who has really great language proficiency, or even contracting with an outside service. So one of the questions that came in was, what is the process for translation for documents like the BMV study guide? Do you have folks who speak that language to review it? So the first part of that, with translation work, if you're going to use a third-party provider, you simply send them the documents and they'll quote it. So translation work is typically quoted by the number of words, the source and target language. So if I'm translating something into a really accessible language that's a little bit of a simpler language like Spanish, that language is going to be more affordable than a language that's more rare or more complex like Japanese. So we typically tell people, just send us the documents that you have and we'll create an itemized and a really transparent quote for you. Then you can understand exactly what that project is going to cost. And you can prioritize what you'd like to have completed. And Sarah, as far as folks who speak the language to review the BMV study guide, is that something that Exodus helps with?
So maybe I'm not understanding the question, but is it in terms of like if Exodus was the one to review those study guides to translate them?
So I'm wondering if the question is, do you have folks that can help someone to walk through a study guide to make sure they understand it?
Yeah, so before they were translated, what we had was volunteers, and for about a year we had a class that was basically studying the permit exam, and rather than having translated documents, we had a 3-week class for students, and they'd come in during a specific time during the day, and we'd have an interpreter in that class, and then we'd go through the manual together. So it was more in-person classes and via interpreters.
Gotcha. And then I actually have 2 questions very specifically focused about the school systems. So maybe we can kind of talk about that for just a minute. The first was, what barriers do immigrants have within the school systems? And the second, that goes right along with that, are what are some inclusive practices or services that you have seen schools do that are helpful for families, or gaps that you think are being left behind in this area? Jackie, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. So I think in terms of the barriers that immigrants face within the school system, I mean, there are so many barriers, but it can range from initially enrolling your child into a school system. Here in Indianapolis, I know IPS does offer programs for immigrant students who are adjusting, and there's programs specifically for students who maybe are speaking another language and need to learn English quickly. But there can be a huge disconnect in terms of, the children may learn English relatively quickly if they're in that environment every day. But then there could be a language gap between the parents or the guardians and those children. So that's something that we see as a barrier as well. And then just getting information that is accessible in their own language and in the preferred language that immigrant families may speak can sometimes be difficult as well.
Sarah, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think specifically now that we're, our kids for a few months were doing e-learning, and now that might be the case in the fall as well. I mean, children are kind of on their own. They're doing homework on their own. They're studying on their own because their parents, one, are not familiar with the curriculum, and two, if they can't read and write in English, they're not able to really provide support for their kids. So I think that's one barrier that kids have had during e-learning.
And I will say Luna works really closely with the school systems here, including the largest school system, which is IPS, which Jackie mentioned. We typically see a lot, like teachers, a lot of the ESL or English as a second language teachers are really adept at working with these students, right? Like that's typically the communication between the students is already handled by the teachers, and they have the tools to be able to do that. I think where Luna sees more support is for the teachers or the administrators with the parents, as you both mentioned. I know a lot of schools sometimes will use the children as interpreters because the kids have acquired some English language proficiency. But if you're having a parent-teacher conference with the parent to talk about the kid and a challenge that they're having, is it appropriate to have that child interpreting that conversation, right? Or does the child have enough proficiency to be able to communicate that? So we see a lot of support between the parents and the teachers and administrators. Also, to kind of answer your question about schools and inclusive practices and what they're doing, one thing that you can research is something called the Newcomer Program that Indianapolis Public Schools has. It's a really fabulous program where children who are new to the country, or families who are new to the country, they all come to this centralized school. I believe they have 5 grades offered at this point, to kind of acclimate to the American school system, to provide extra language support, to provide extra peer support for kids who see other kids that look like them or that come from the same type of background. But they also provide a food pantry. They have a clothing closet for folks, and that could include, it almost looks like a little Goodwill inside of the school. So they actually have professional clothes for parents and regular clothes for parents, in addition to extra uniforms for kids. That can be a barrier too. They also have a reading room. They have all sorts of resources to really embrace the families as they're starting over, because we all know that kids, if they have a much more stable and reliable home environment, then they're going to learn much better as well, right? So that's one thing I would suggest to folks who are thinking about the school systems is research the Indianapolis Public Schools Newcomer Program and check out what they're doing, because they're doing a fabulous job. All right, so moving on to the next question, kind of the overall question that I'd like to address with all 3 of you. What organizations should consider investing time and resources into language access, and why? Duchess, I'd love for you to kick this off.
Sure. So I think definitely every public health and humanitarian organization like the Red Cross should definitely consider that. But really, I think organizations that serve people should really be thinking about this. Organizations and companies, I think being culturally inclusive and leaning into language access is hugely important for global citizens. And as we've been talking all day, I mean, sometimes maybe people don't think, oh, Indiana is a place that has a lot of different types of people who speak a lot of different types of languages and from a lot of different backgrounds. But clearly, we're seeing with the statistics and the information that's out there that is true.
Thank you. Jackie, would you like to go next?
Sure. So kind of going off of what Duchess said, I mean, I think for any nonprofit or community-based organization, investing time and resources into language access is extremely important. And I would go a step further and say that for any private business, it's also incredibly important, because as we're seeing with technology, we've really scaled down the world, and we are a global economy. We're a global community now. And so I think in order to stay relevant and in order to be inclusive, it's very important to recognize that, the United States is not just one group of people. It is many, many groups of people, and immigrants come to this country for a reason. And I think we needed to be inclusive and provide access to resources that are available in other languages to kind of address that.
Thank you. Sarah, anything to add to that?
I would say especially folks who receive some sort of federal funding, I think that's very important. I mean, language access is a basic human right, and I think everyone should consider to provide language access to provide language access for folks, especially if you're claiming that you're going to serve the community. You can't just pick and choose who you're going to serve, or just say, oh, our services are for English only speakers. You really need to dive deep and look at the community that you're serving. And the Civil Rights Act protects equitable services for people, and language access is one of them. So especially if your clinic accepts Medicaid, I mean, that's something that you have to look into by providing interpreters and providing translations for your patients and your clients. But I'd also tell people that to keep in mind that to continue to keep your services personal. There's only not a language access barriers in the city, but there's also a literacy barrier within different groups. So a lot of people can't read and write in their own native language. And so keeping that in mind. So, when you do have a language access plan, that's great, but also making sure that it's going to be flexible and you're going to adjust it based off of individuals, and seeing people as people and helping them with their individual needs and services, and tailoring to them is also very, very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Becky.
I was just going to say, if I could jump in on that point about literacy in native languages. So the Immigrant Welcome Center, we've been conducting a study and have currently a campaign running called the Adult English Pathways to Literacy program. And this is a really important point that you're touching on, Sarah, because language access obviously is important, but we also need to recognize that oftentimes immigrants who are coming to the United States may not even have third or fourth grade literacy level in their own native language. So then, making something accessible to them in their own language, their own native language, is obviously the first, one of many steps. But I'd say that it's equally important to recognize that there needs to be access to programs that specifically cater to those audiences as well. But that's just a really great point to touch on, Sarah.
Yeah, and I'll give you guys some specific examples of organizations that I just over the past 2 years have started working with, where they don't very specifically service immigrants and refugees or the deaf and hard of hearing population, but it was really important to them to start to reach out to those communities or to make sure that they were included in their services. One of the organizations that we partnered with is Cotter Prairie, which is a historical museum that's up on the north side. It's actually like the #1 fourth grade field trip destination in the state, I think. So they service all the schools all over the state. They have people from all over coming to experience their museum. And so this year it was really important for us to start implementing accessibility to the deaf and hard of hearing population. So we hosted a Deaf Heritage Day where we talked about deaf history in Indiana and the founding of the Indiana School for the Deaf. We had ASL interpreters all over the grounds so that the deaf community could access and have live conversations with their actors. And then they also more recently had decided to start having American Sign Language interpreters on their virtual programming. So having folks just like Mandy interpret virtual programming so that it's as accessible as possible to the deaf community. And they've seen a lot of really great activation of that population, and a lot of folks who have started patroning their museum because they feel seen and they feel like those experiences are meant for them as well. I also see great organizations like the Girl Scouts has a really great Latinx program, and everything is available in Spanish. We've been talking with WFYI about making sure that their broadcasts and some of their programming is accessible as well. So again, just some examples of organizations that are notable and that are taking a look at this. and that are starting to implement some of these tactics as well. So really then the last question that I have, and I know we're right at 12:45, so hopefully you guys can hang on for just a few more minutes, is what are some of the benefits or the return on investment points that you see with investing in language access? In other words, what would be your argument as to the business reason why any of the organizations that we just talked about should be thinking about language access in investing in the resources to overcome language barriers? Duchess, I'd love for you to kick this one off.
Sure. So it definitely pays. And I guess I'm not only talking about monetarily, because I think that the investment that you are making in this area, your business, quite frankly, will be leaps and bounds ahead of others. I guess I asked the question, what are we waiting for? Because when it comes to being the expert or the place that people think about, they'll think about your business first, because you have actually made an investment in this area. And I think that's because, you definitely took the time and the energy to be inclusive, to think broadly, to really embrace our whole society, and being intentional, because you're being intentional about language access. I also think to build on, the return on investment, to go a little bit bolder, and embrace kind of our cultural ecosystem, really the return on culture. I think by supporting the linguistical needs of people within our communities, I think we're really positioning ourselves to be global leaders of the 21st century. And I think as global citizens, we certainly can push ourselves to stand for justice, respect, and opportunities for all. So, I think it's a really great question, Tiffany. So I think that's what I would say for sure.
Well, that's a really great answer, Duchess. So thank you for that. I love it.
Thank you.
Sarah, would you like to go next on this last one?
Yeah, I would add that I think when we invest in people and they are able to thrive, our community then is able to thrive. And specifically in the workforce, when you have language access in your company or in your warehouse where a lot of people, don't speak English, then there will be less turnover if they are able to, one, feel comfortable in their job, and if they like their job, and if they feel like they're able to communicate with their supervisor and with their teammates as well. And so there will definitely be less turnover in the workplace if people are investing more in language access in those spaces.
Great answer. And Jackie, anything to add to this?
Sure. I think that kind of going off what Duchess was saying about what was it you said, the return on culture? Yeah. So the concept of, for businesses, for private businesses, if they're investing in these kinds of language access programs, ultimately, I think if more businesses do that, I think it creates a precedence that Indianapolis is working to become a more welcoming city for immigrants. So in the sense that if a lot of businesses are participating in this, I think it just makes the city more accessible and inclusive. And it goes to show that, we not only care about people who speak English, but all people who are here. We all matter. All of our voices matter. And, if you're specifically a business that is business to consumer, if you are investing in language access, well, suddenly your clientele opens up to not only English speakers, so you're putting yourself in front of a whole new audience, and so you're likely to gain more exposure and things like that. But in terms of, as Sarah said, sort of implementing it on the back end, for your employees, that's also a really great opportunity to reduce turnover and things like that. But all of this work, all of these steps that small businesses and larger businesses can take, I think, create, yes, a city that's more inclusive, and ultimately that draws more immigrants and more non-English speakers to this community, and in turn, they continue to invest in our community, in our economy, and so it's just the benefits are unlimited, essentially.
Absolutely. And I'd like to, this kind of goes along with what we all just said, and also brings me to kind of my closing statement. So This was an anonymous question that was put in, but whoever put it in, thank you so much, because it's a perfect segue. It says, in what ways can we share your collective experiences and knowledge into creating a local ordinance law to encourage city and county government to include language access on their day-to-day communication? And the answer is they're already mandated by law to make sure that their services and their information is accessible. There are some guidelines for the government on the threshold of the populations. So like we need to have a certain number of Spanish speakers in the area for the government to be mandated to provide more things in Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. But those are things that your government, your local government should already be doing. So if they're not doing that, finding the right people to ask questions to. I know here at Indianapolis, my dear friend Jordan Rodriguez is the Director of International and Latino Affairs for the city. He does a great job of implementing language access and fighting for that. But there should be similar folks in your government, in your governmental institutions that should be thinking about this. And I also have a memo that Luna Language Services wrote for the city of Indianapolis talking about what language access in a city looks like, kind of all of these arguments about why cities should be thinking about this more and how to make things more inclusive, and providing examples of what other cities across the country have done to make sure that their messaging and that their resources are accessible in different languages. So if you'd like any additional information, including that memo or anything else from myself or any of the panelists today, I will be sending out a follow-up email that has a link to the recorded video of this, as well as contact information for any of the folks that were included here. So if you'd like to reach out to anyone about the services that their organization provides, or if you have any questions about anything that we talked about today, then you'll have all that contact information yourself. So with that being said, ladies, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us today and for providing your valuable insights. And I love the cultural return. That's going to be like my new favorite thing now. But thank you so much for being here today. And thank you to everyone who registered for the event, and let us know if you have any questions. Have a great day.